As I was making episode 2, I thought it would be a short one. Turns out, I was as delusional as Auguste with Sylvia. Between calculating debuffs and ranking all the units, this video just kept getting longer and longer. It ended up being 48 minutes long. If you're here just for the rankings, feel free to skip ahead to around minute 8. This is a continuation of my previous video with a few changes to the test. This time, I'll be testing with a base attack of 4000, since there were no significant differences between 3500 and 4000. Additionally, I'll be removing 2 scenarios and focusing only on the remaining 2, as damage reduction has no impact on either damage increase or damage taken. Let's start with the first scenario, where the enemy has no defense increase or damage reduction. The blue represents defense down, while the orange represents damage taken. Damage taken outperforms defense down when the enemy's defense is between 1700 and 2000. However, at 2100 defense, only high percentage damage taken can outperforms defense down. Now let's move on to the second scenario, where the enemy has a 40% defense increase. In this case, damage taken only outperforms defense down when the enemy's defense is at 1700. This 40% defense boost makes a significant difference between the two debuffs. In the first test, we saw that damage taken and defense down were evenly matched. Damage taken performs better when the enemy's defense is between 1700 and 2100, depending on the percentage, while defense down is superior when the enemy's defense is between 2100 and 2500. However, if the enemy has a defense increase buff, then defense down becomes unmatched, taking first place. Let's dive into the second test, where we'll explore the best possible buff combinations. In my previous video, I explained each graph using highs and lows, but that led to a rather vague explanation. This time, I'll use actual in-game values for more precise details. Before we get into the explanation, let me first go over where you can obtain all these debuffs. You can obtain defense down and damage taken from a few sources. From your character. Currently, you can only reach up to tier 3 for both defense down and damage taken. From your tactics. You can get up to 80% damage taken and 20% defense down. From the longbow of martyrs. This weapon provides an additional 10% damage taken. I'll start by focusing only on the debuffs your character can provide, excluding tactics and the longbow, since those depend on whether you use tactics or if your character is a bow type. I'll start by discussing the tier 1 debuff that deals the most damage and then continue from there. Between tier 1 vulnerable and defense down, tier 1 defense down deals more damage. Next, would you prefer a tier 2 defense down or both tier 1 debuffs? The tier 2 defense down deals more damage, estimated to inflict 13% to 18% additional damage. Next, does the tier 2 defense down outperform a tier 1 defense down and tier 2 damage taken? In this case, the combination of tier 1 defense down and tier 2 damage taken inflicts more damage, estimated to be 2% to 6% additional damage. Next, does the tier 2 defense down and tier 1 damage taken deal more damage than a tier 3 defense down? A tier 3 defense down inflicts more damage, estimated to be 5% to 18% additional damage. However, it falls short against both tier 2 defense down and damage taken, which are estimated to deal an additional 2% to 8% damage. Next, does the tier 2 defense down and tier 3 damage taken deal more damage than tier 2 defense down and at a wine barrel? The combination of tier 2 defense down and tier 3 damage taken inflicts more damage, estimated to be 8% to 17% additional damage. However, it falls short against tier 3 defense down and tier 2 damage taken, which are estimated to deal an additional 3% to 6% damage. Next, does the tier 3 defense down combined with tier 3 damage taken deal more damage than a tier 3 defense down and at a barrel? The combination of tier 3 defense down and tier 3 damage taken inflicts more damage, estimated to be 8% to 11% additional damage. However, it falls short against 80% defense down and tier 2 damage taken, which are estimated to deal an additional 2% to 5% damage. Next, does 100% defense down and tier 2 damage taken deal more damage than 80% defense down and tier 3 damage taken? The combination of 100% defense down and tier 2 damage taken inflicts more damage, estimated to be 9% to 14% additional damage. Since you can't reduce the enemy's defense beyond 100%, I stopped here. The only way to get more damage is by adding tier 3 damage taken. Now there are some rules. Rule number 1. If you have a base attack of 3500 to 3700 and the enemy's base defense is between 1700 and 1900, or a base attack of 3800 to 4000 and the enemy's base defense is between 1700 and 2100, nothing changes. that's the order you want to follow. However, starting around 2000 base defense, the statement about Tier 2 defense down and Tier 3 damage taken dealing more damage is false. From this point on, 80% defense down deals more damage. Before I continue, if you have the tactic War Horn, this is what the debuff distribution will look like, even if the enemy's defense reaches 2500. This applies to both 3500 to 4000 base attack. Next, rule number 2. If you have a base attack of 3500 to 3700 and the enemy has a base defense between 2000 and 2100, or a base attack of 3800 to 4000 and the enemy's base defense is between 2200 and 2300, the statement about Tier 1 defense down and Tier 2 damage taken dealing more damage is false. In this case, you'll need Tier 3 damage taken to outperform Tier 2 defense down. Additionally, starting around 2200 base defense, the statement about Tier 3 defense down and Tier 3 damage taken dealing more damage is false. From this point on, 100% defense down deals more damage. Next, rule number 3. If you have a base attack of 3500 to 3700 and the enemy has a base defense between 2200 and 2500, or a base attack of 3800 to 4000 and the enemy's base defense is between 2400 and 2500, the statement about Tier 2 defense down and Tier 2 damage taken dealing more damage is false. In this case, you'll need Tier 3 damage taken to outperform Tier 3 defense down. Now, what if you're using the Longbow of Martyrs? Nothing changes, just follow the same rules explained before. For reference, to my knowledge, only magic defense can reach 100% and 80% defense down without using War Horn. For physical defense, it can only reach up to 60%, but with War Horn you can increase it to 80%. To further reduce enemy defense, you'll need Hasna or Magnus, as both of their traits can lower enemy defense by 15% if the enemy is near them. Now, what if the enemy has a 40% defense increase? In that case, follow rule number 1 only if you have a base attack of 3500 to 4000, and the enemy's base defense is at 1700. Follow rule number 2 when you have a base attack of 3500 to 3700 and the enemy's base defense is at 1800. Or a base attack of 3800 to 4000 and the enemy's base defense is between 1800 to 2000. When the enemy's base defense reaches 2000, the statement regarding Tier 1 defense down and Tier 3 damage taken is false. From this point, Tier 2 defense down deals more damage. Follow rule number 3 when you have a base attack of 3500 to 3700 and the enemy's base defense is between 1900 and 2500. Or a base attack of 3800 to 4000 and the enemy's base defense is between 2100 and 2500. When the enemy's base defense reaches 2100, the statement regarding Tier 2 defense down and Tier 3 damage taken is false. Tier 3 defense down deals more damage. Additionally, Tier 3 defense down and Tier 2 damage taken loses to 80% defense down. And when the enemy's base defense reaches 2200, the statement regarding Tier 3 defense down and Tier 3 damage taken also loses to 80% defense down. Let me know in the comments if this explanation is clearer or if I should simply display which buffs are better, using high and low indicators like in the first episode. Now that we've covered all the buffs and debuffs, I'll be ranking each character based on the buffs and debuffs they provide. This suggestion came from a viewer asking which characters offer buffs or debuffs. I'll also be covering all the characters currently available on the Chinese side. Some of the character names might be incorrect due to translation errors. Before I begin my explanation, I want to clarify that I will only be covering the buffs and debuffs that enhance your damage output. Defensive buffs such as defense up, damage reduction or healing, as well as debuffs that disrupt passive abilities, reactions, auras or movement, will not be included. While these effects are important, this series is entirely dedicated to offensive buffs, so I will be ranking only those that enhance damage output. The criteria I use to rank each character are as follows: energy cost of the skill, downtime of the buffs and debuffs, tier level of the buffs, speed of the character. I will divide the characters into different categories. For debuffs, defense down. This includes both physical and magical defense. Vulnerable. All types of damage taken will be included here. Speed, buffs that affect speed. Extra debuffs. This one can stack with all the other debuffs mentioned previously. RNG debuffs. Debuffs that have random effects. For buffs, attack. Buffs that enhance attack power. Damage. This includes all types of damage increases. Speed, buffs that affect speed. Critical hit. Buffs that increase critical hit chance. Critical damage. Buffs that enhance critical damage output. Extra buffs. This one can stack with all the other buffs mentioned previously. Self-buffs. Buffs that only apply to the character themselves. I've only listed those for legendary units, excluding others. RNG buffs. Buffs that have random effects. Before we begin, I want to clarify that I will only be ranking buffs and debuffs from tier 2 and above. While I will display tier 1 buffs and debuffs, my analysis will focus solely on tier 2 and higher. All the analysis are based if the characters are at 5 stars, and the debuffs inflicted are after the enemy takes their turn. Otherwise, you can simply add an extra turn to the downtime, which would indicate how many turns the enemy has without the debuff. Disclaimer: my ranking is based solely on the buffs and debuffs that each unit provides. This does not imply that one unit is inherently better or worse than another. I am only considering the skills relevant to each category and ignoring the rest of the character's kit. If you're looking for a ranking that takes the entire kit of a unit into account, I recommend checking out Dotato's video ranking all the legendary units. Let's start with debuffs. The units listed at the top affect only physical defense, while those at the bottom affect only magical defense. For physical debuffs. If you're looking for the best physical defense down, Homa takes the top spot without a doubt. She is the only unit with a tier 3 debuff and has no downtime. The skill has no cooldown and only costs 2 energy, allowing her to maintain the debuff at all times if she chooses. The only downside is that it is a single target. The skill has a range of 1 to 4 tiles and her speed is 210. The next unit is Auguste, who can charge towards an enemy and apply an area of effect defense down. The skill has a range of 1 to 2 tiles and it has a downtime of 1 turn. His speed is 209. Following him is Pamina. Her skill also has area of effect. I placed her lower than Auguste because he can close the distance more effectively with his charge ability. The skill has a range of 1 to 2 tiles, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 198. Then we have Coco. The skill has a range of 1 tile, targets only a single enemy, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 221. Next is Sophia, who can apply both physical and magical defense down. However, her skill costs 4 energy, so to use it on turn 1, you'll need assistance from another unit or item to fill the missing energy. The skill has a range of 1 to 3 tiles, targets only a single enemy, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 179. After her is Rowia, whose area of effect skill also costs 4 energy, but she lacks the energy recovery skill that Sophia has. The skill has a range of 1 to 2 tiles, and has a downtime of just 2 turns. Her speed is 204. The remaining legendary units either have high cooldowns, their debuffs last only 1 turn, or the skill has a chance to fail. Honorable mention. Outlaw Guard, like Etta, has an ability that can apply physical defense down, though it's not guaranteed. However, he can reliably apply attack down each turn. His skill has a range of 1 to 3 tiles, targets only a single enemy, and he has a speed of 230. Next we have magical debuffs. This time we have only 3 viable options. In first place is Carlisle. Like Homa, she is the only unit with a tier 3 debuff. However, her low speed of 126 and a 4-turn cooldown while the effect only lasts 2 turns are her 2 downsides. The skill has a range of 1 to 3 tiles, can target multiple enemies. If you're looking for consistency, Akambi is the way to go. He can pull all enemies together while also lowering their magical defense. His skill has a range of 3 to 5 tiles, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. His speed is 123. Finally, we have Sophia, whose skill is identical to the one that applies physical defense down. Next debuff is Vulnerable. Let's discuss the vulnerable skills. At tier 2, the units at the top are reaction skills which you might not prioritize. The leading contender is Tear. While he is only tier 2, his exceptional speed allows him to act first more often. Additionally, his skill is instant, enabling him to act again immediately. The only downside is that his skill is single target and tier 2. It has a range of 0 to 5 tiles and has no downtime if he chooses only to debuff the enemy. His speed is 288. Next, we have Lila, who offers an area of effect skill with a range of 2 squares around her and a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 233. Next, No Will is the only character with a tier 3 vulnerable skill. Not only is it an area of effect skill, but it is also instant. However, her speed is a drawback as some DPS units may act before her, which is why she ranks 3rd. If acting first isn't a priority for you, then No Will is your top choice. The skill has a range of 2 tiles around her and a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 159. Next is Tidon. His skill has a range of 1 to 3 cross and has a downtime of 2 turn. Can target multiple enemies. His speed is 235. Next is Nurgle, whose skill is instant and can apply the Hanged Men's Mark, making him a solid option if you're running a Hanged Men team. His skill has a range of 1 to 5 tiles in front of him, can target multiple enemies, and has a downtime of 2 turns. His speed is 232. Next we have a tie between Coco and Magnus. They share the same skill and both have high speed, allowing them to act before DPS units. The skill has a range of 1 tile and a downtime of just 1 turn. Magnus has a speed of 231, while Coco has a speed of 221. Next, Agata, who can apply speed down as well. The skill has a range of 1 to 3 cross and has no downtime. Can target multiple enemies. Her speed is 151. The remaining units either have skills with long cooldowns, require them to be attacked, or need an enemy near them to be defeated to activate their effects. Now for Shaklalu and Koir, the effects they provide differ from the rest. If you're looking to increase damage over time, Shaklalu is your best option. Not only it is tier 3, but is an instant skill allowing her to act again afterward. The skill has a range of 1 to 3 tiles in a cross pattern and has a downtime of 1 to 2 turns, depending on whether the trait triggers. Her speed is 164. On the other hand, if you're aiming for piercing damage, Koir is the way to go. His skill has a range of 6 tiles around him and a downtime of 1 turn. His speed is 272. Additionally, the enemy must have a specific debuff called List. Koir can inflict the List debuff on an enemy, costing 2 energy, and it is also instant. However, the first time you use this skill each turn, the energy cost is refunded. Next debuff is Speed. Koir takes first place due to his high speed, allowing him to act before most enemies. His skill has a range of 1 to 4 tiles and no downtime. His speed is 272. Next, we have Enforcer, the only unit with a tier 3 passive skill, meaning any attack will trigger the effect. If you prioritize the tier of the debuff over acting first, then Enforcer is a better choice than Koir. His skill has a range of 1 tile and has no downtime. His speed is 182. The next choice depends on whether you want the enemy to have vulnerable or physical defense down. Agata can apply vulnerable with a skill that has a range of 1 to 3 tiles in a cross pattern, can target multiple enemies, and has no downtime. Her speed is 151. On the other hand, Coco can apply physical defense down with the same skill but has a downtime of 1 turn. Next is Inanna. While she doesn't have a speed debuff, her summon does. The summons has a range of 1 tile, targets a single enemy, and has a downtime of 1 turn. The summon has a speed of 239. Lastly, we have Xavier. Although his speed can be quite high, the cost of his skill is 5 energy, which limits his effectiveness. His skill has a range of 1 to 3 tiles in a cross pattern and a downtime of 3 turns. Can target multiple enemies. His speed is either 193 or 343, depending on the situation. Next is extra debuffs. Let's start with the effects that lower enemy defense. Hasna and Magnus share the same ability, reducing enemy defense by 15% when they are within 5 tiles. Etta can further lower the enemy defense by 40% but only for magic defense. Lastly, Flavia also has an aura that lowers enemy defense by 10%, but the enemy needs to be inside the flower field that she creates. If I had to choose between Hasna and Magnus, I would select Magnus due to his higher speed. Etta can also reduce defense but only for magic defense, and her skill is instant. If your goal is to further lower physical defense, Magnus is the way to go. His trait has a range of 4 tiles around him, and his speed is 231. If you aim to decrease magic defense, then Etta is the better choice. Her skill has a range of 2 to 4 tiles, can target multiple enemies, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 93. Next is extra damage taken. Each unit offers different benefits. If you're looking for another source of vulnerable, consider Pamina. However, please note that the translation of her debuff is unclear, so I can't confirm whether the debuff applies solely to Pamina's attacks or if other units can benefit from it as well. I'm assuming that other units benefit from her debuffs. Her skill has a range of 2 to 4 tiles, can target multiple enemies, and has a downtime of 2 turns. Her speed is 198. For an additional source of piercing damage taken, Agata is the option to choose. Her skill has a range of 2 tiles in a cross pattern, can target multiple enemies, and has no downtime. Her speed is 151. If you're interested in another source of damage over time taken, then Momo is your best bet. Her trait has a range of 4 tiles around her, and her speed is 132. Next is extra speed. Layla, Summer Rawiyah, and Bitter Medicine all share the same skill, which has an instant effect, costs no energy and has a cooldown of 3 turns. The effect lasts for 2 turns. If you're looking for extra speed reduction, Layla takes the top spot due to her superior speed compared to the other units. Her skill has a range of 1 to 2 tiles, targets only a single enemy, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 233. Next is Summer Rawiyah. Her skill also has a range of 1 to 2 tiles, targets a single enemy, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 180. Following them is Chia, whose effect lasts only 1 turn and costs 3 energy with a 3-turn cooldown. However, she can reduce her cooldown if an enemy is defeated. Her skill has a range of 1 to 2 tiles, targets only a single enemy, and has a downtime of 1 to 2 turns. Her speed is 187. Then we have Edda. Her skill has a range of 2 to 4 tiles, can target multiple enemies, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 93. Honorable mention, Bitter Medicine can lower enemy speed and buff her allies with tier 2 attack in the same turn. Her skill has a range of 1 to 2 tiles, targets only a single enemy, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 80. Next we have the RNG debuffs. There are 2 versions of this type of debuff, with the main difference being that the one on the right adds 3 additional debuffs: passive skills, reaction skills, and attribute skills. While all 3 are valuable if you're focusing solely on getting attack and defense, incorporating these additional debuffs can make it more challenging to achieve your goals. Only Akambi and Faekal have the debuffs from the right. Top contenders in RNG debuffs is Koir, who has a high speed compared to the others and inflicts 3 level 2 debuffs on a single target. His skill has a range of 1 to 3 tiles and has no downtime. His speed is 272. Next we have a tie between Chia and Tristan. Both inflict 2 level 2 debuffs and have area of effect skills. The only difference is that Tristan has slightly better range but 2 points lower speed than Chia. Tristan's skill has a range of 4 tiles around her, can target multiple enemies, and has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 185. Chia's skill has a range of 3 tiles around her, can target multiple enemies, and also has a downtime of just 1 turn. Her speed is 187. Next is Summer Rawiyah. Her passive skill applies 1 random level 2 debuff within a 2 square range after each active attack, up to 3 times per round with no downtime. Summer Rawiyah has a speed of 180. Following them is Dantalion, who shares the same skill as Tristan. His speed is 175. Next is Carlisle, who has the same skill as Koir. The reason I placed her lower is due to her speed, which is 126. Following her is Akambi. Although he doesn't have the level 2 debuff himself, his summon does, and each summon can trigger twice per turn. If you can protect the summon, Akambi is the only character capable of inflicting more than 3 level 2 debuffs per turn. However, he ranks lower because he relies on the summon to apply the debuffs, and his speed is only 123. His summon has a range of 5 tiles around them. Then we have Faekal. Any damage he deals to an enemy will inflict a level 2 debuff. It might be possible to inflict up to 5 level 2 debuffs on a single target using the skill Gale, Billow Valley, but I'm not entirely sure. His speed is 105. Following him is Sophia. Like Akambi, she doesn't have level 2 debuffs herself, but her summon does. This time, it requires the summon to die in order to inflict the level 2 debuffs. The skill has a range of 1 square around the summon, can target multiple enemies, and the effect lasts for 2 turns. Sophia has a speed of 179. In last place is Miguel. He can apply 2 debuffs, but this requires him to perform a back attack or for the enemy to attack him from the front or side. His speed is 111. This concludes with all the debuffs. Now let's move on with buffs. There are only 3 units that can provide AoE attack: Akambi, Beryl, and Tristan. In this section, I prioritized units based on the number of attacks they apply to different allies. In first place we have a tie between Akambi and Beryl. Both provide AoE attack tier 2, but Akambi also grants 1 extra energy and increased defense, while Beryl adds immunity to attack attribute debuffs. The downside is that both units have relatively low speed, meaning DPS units will likely act first. Akambi's skill has a range of 3 tiles around him, targets multiple allies, lasts for 2 turns, and has a cooldown of 3 turns. His speed is 123. Additionally, Akambi provides a tier 4 attack buff, but only to summoned units. Barrel's skill has a range of 0 to 2 tiles around the target, also targets multiple allies, lasts for 2 turns, and has a cooldown of 3 turns. Her speed is 122. If your goal is to buff on turn 1, all the units from here on can accomplish that. Next is Homa. Her skill has a range of 1 to 4 tiles, targets only a single ally, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 3 turns. Homa has a speed of 210. Following Homa is Tear. His skill has a range of 1 to 3 tiles, also targets a single ally, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 3 turns. Tear has a speed of 288. He ranks lower than Homa only because Homa can apply an additional attack buff to herself. Next is Flavia. Her skill has a range of 0 to 5 tiles, targets a single ally, the effect lasts for 3 turns and has a cooldown of 1 turn. Flavia has a speed of 224. Next is Inanna. Although her speed is lower than any DPS unit, she provides an Act Again buff. The skill has a range of 1 to 2 tiles, targets only a single ally, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 3 turns. Inanna has a speed of 65. Finally we have Gloria. Her skill has a range of 1 to 2 tiles, targets only a single ally, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 4 turns. Gloria has a speed of 215. The reason the last 2 units are placed so low is due to the constraints of their skills or the need for an enemy to focus on a particular unit. Coir's skill has a range of 1 to 5 tiles around him and targets only a single ally. The effect lasts for 2 turns, and Coir has a speed of 272. His skill also provides damage tier 2, making him the only unit able to provide both attack and damage buffs in a single skill. However, the downside is that this skill can be used only once per battle. Next is Tristan, who can buff all units within 3 squares of her. However, her passive skill has specific requirements. An enemy must either attack an ally within 2 tiles of her while she is healthy or target Tristan herself if she is in a dying state. The effect lasts for 2 turns, targets multiple allies, and Tristan has a speed of 185. If you can consistently activate her passive, she would undoubtedly secure the top spot. Let's move on to the damage buffs. At tier 2, the units listed at the top require the target to be unharmed to apply their damage buffs. In first place we have Etta, who can provide a tier 3 damage buff. Her skill has a range of 0 to 3 tiles around her, can target multiple allies, the effect lasts for 3 turns and has a cooldown of 4 turns. Etta has a speed of 93. If you're looking to buff on turn 1, Flavia is your best choice. Her trait provides a tier 2 damage buff to allies within her flower field, which is created within 2 tiles around her at the start of battle. As long as allies remain in this area, they'll receive the buff. Flavia has a speed of 224, ensuring she can set up more flower field before any DPS. Next is Magnus. While his passive requires an enemy to die near him to trigger, it can also be activated using the skill called Mountain Breaker. The downside is that it provides only a tier 2 damage buff. The range of his passive is global, can target multiple allies, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 1 turn. Magnus has a speed of 231. Next is Coco, who also provides a tier 3 damage buff. Her skill has a range of 1 square around her, targets only a single ally, the effect lasts for 3 turns and has a cooldown of 2 turns. Coco has a speed of 221. Following Coco is Tear, whose skill is a tier 2 damage buff but has an instant effect. The skill has a range of 0 to 5, targets only a single ally, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has no cooldown. Tear has a speed of 288. Lastly we have Coir. His skill can be used only once per battle and also provides a tier 2 attack buff. The skill has a range of 1 to 5 tiles around him and targets only a single ally. The effect lasts for 2 turns, and Coir has a speed of 272. The next 2 units share the same skill, which requires the target unit to be at 100% HP. Leonide's skill has a range of 0 to 3 tiles, targets only a single ally, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 3 turns. Leonide has a speed of 195. Carlisle's skill has a range of 0 to 3 tiles, targets only a single ally, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 3 turns. Carlisle has a speed of 126. Now let's move on to speed buffs. In first place is Tear. Although his buff is only tier 2, he might be your only option for speed buffs. Tear's skill has a range of 0 to 3 tiles, can target multiple allies, the effect lasts for 2 turns, and has a cooldown of 2 turns. Tear has a speed of 288. Next is Sophia. The reason I consider Tear the only real option for speed buffs is that, although Sophia's buff is tier 3, it only lasts for 1 turn and targets the ally closest to her. Additionally, the buff can affect summoned units, which is worth keeping in mind. The effect lasts for 1 turns. Sophia has a speed of 179. Now let's move on to critical hit buffs. At the top, we have Coco, who provides a tier 2 buff. Her skill has a range of 3 tiles around her, can target multiple allies, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 3 turns. Coco has a speed of 221. Next is Flavia. Her skill has a range of 0 to 5 tiles, targets a single ally, the effect lasts for 3 turns and has a cooldown of 1 turn. Flavia has a speed of 224. This is the same skill that provides attack tier 2, making her the only unit able to provide both attack and crit buffs in a single skill. Now let's move on to critical damage buffs. This time there's only one option, Coco. She uses the same skill that provides a tier 2 critical hit buff. The skill has a range of 3 tiles around her, can target multiple allies, the effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 3 turns. Coco has a speed of 221. Now let's move on to extra buffs. All the units at the top have a basic leader aura, while those at the bottom have a unique leader aura. Both the basic and unique auras provide a 10% attack increase and 20% defense increase, but the unique leader aura also includes additional effects. I'll be focusing only on the unique leader auras. Lila's leader aura provides an additional 12% damage increase to the Scarlet Knight faction. There are 2 units with leader auras in the Discipline faction. Akambi's leader aura adds a cooldown reduction for skills with 4 or more turns and provides a 20% damage increase to summoned units. Meanwhile, Leonide's leader aura adds a cooldown reduction for skills with fewer than 4 turns. Carlyle's leader aura for the Papal States faction provides an extra 12% piercing damage, damage increase, and damage reduction when the target has 4 or more buffs. In the Alacrity faction there are 2 units with leader auras. The better option is Kal's leader aura, which grants a 15% increase to critical hit and critical damage, while Nurgle's only increases critical hit by 15%. Magnus' leader aura for the Fortitude faction adds a 10% damage reduction when at healthy state and grants immunity to the injured state. Lilywill's leader aura for the Vulder faction provides 1 extra movement point. Nanoel's leader aura for the Aggression faction provides an extra 10% damage increase to skills. Dantalion's leader aura for the Iria faction offers a 20% damage increase if the target has 3 or more debuffs. Rowio's leader aura for the Sword of Convallaria faction grants an 8% damage increase and damage reduction. Miguel's leader aura for the Drifter faction provides a 5% increase to attack and a 10% increase to defense. Gloria's leader aura for the Union faction offers a 12% damage increase to active attacks and a 24% damage reduction when struck back. Next, let's look at auras that increase attack. At the top is Gloria, whose aura provides a 12% increase to attack and defense within 3 tiles around her if she's holding the flag. If she throws the flag, it increases attack and defense by 15% across the entire map. Next is Sophia, who grants a 15% attack increase to all allies targeting an enemy with the Hanged Man's mark, as long as they're within 5 tiles of her. Auguste, Bitter Medicine, and Might share the same aura, providing a 12% attack increase within 2 tiles around them. Last but not least, we have Flavia, whose aura grants a 10% attack increase, but the ally needs to be inside the flower field that she creates. This is the same passive that lowers enemy defense by 10%. The good news is that Flavia does not need to be near the unit, unlike all the other auras, to activate it. Now for the auras that increase critical hit. There are no legendary units in this category. Both Lighting and Divine Grace share the same aura, providing a 20% increase to critical hit within 2 tiles around them. Now for the extra buffs known as Co-Attack. The effect grants a 5% attack increase for each ally within 2 tiles, up to a maximum of 15% attack. Both units offer the same effect, but if I had to choose, I'd go with Summer Sophia. The main difference is that Summer Sophia's skill has no cooldown and grants an extra turn to Scarlet Knight faction allies. Both Inanna and Summer Sophia provide an extra turn to allies from the Iria faction. The skill has a range of 3 tiles around the caster, targets multiple allies, the effect lasts for 3 turns. Now for the extra buffs known as Potential Burst. The effect increases attack by 20% and defense by 40%, and also grants immunity to attribute debuffs. Coir is the only unit capable of using this buff on other units. His skill has a range of 1 to 4 tiles, targets a single ally, lasts for 2 turns and has no cooldown. With a speed of 272, Koir's skill also has the instant effect. However, the downside is that once you use this skill, it transforms into another. To use the skill again, you'll need to activate 5 more skills, only 2 of which have the instant effect. Inanna also has potential burst, but it only applies to her summoned unit, which is why I didn't include her in this section. Now for the extra buffs that increase critical hit. Our only option here is Tear. His skill has a range of 2 tiles around him, targets multiple allies, lasts for 1 turn, and has a cooldown of 4 turns. Tear has a speed of 288, and the skill also provides a 10% damage reduction. The major drawback is that it inflicts sleep on all affected allies. The skill also dispels 3 debuffs. It's possible that dispelling happens after the sleep debuff is applied, but if it occurs first, then this buff is best used if the enemy will follow Tear's turn with an AoE attack or if your allies have sleep immunity. Now for the last extra buff, which is an aura that increases damage. Our only option once again is Tear, who provides a 15% increase to both damage and piercing damage. His skill has a range of 3 tiles around him, targets multiple allies, lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 7 turns. With a speed of 288, the effect also grants immunity to attribute debuffs, restores 15% of HP when ending turn and shares the damage taken. I'm not entirely sure what share damage taken entails, whether it means all damage received by allies is redirected to Tear or if the damage is divided among all units near him. Now let's move on to self-buffs. For speed there's only one unit, Xavier, who gains a tier 3 speed buff. The effect lasts for 2 turns and has a cooldown of 5 turns. Let's move to attack. The units at the top receive standard attack buffs, while those at the bottom gain extra or unique buffs, meaning these can stack with other attack buffs. The units at the top receive a tier 2 attack buff. For attack, I'll focus solely on the units at the bottom of the list, and highlight only the top 5. The top 5 units are as follows. Gloria, she leads with 2 self-buffs. One grants a 20% attack increase when attacking from the front, and the other allows her to gain potential burst for 2 turns when she loses the flag, also providing a 20% attack increase. Second on the list is Garcia, who also has 2 self-buffs. The first, called Rotational Acceleration, can stack up to 9 times, with each stack granting 4% attack. She starts with 3 stacks at the beginning of battle, though reaching full stacks may take time. Her second self-buff is Potential Burst, giving a 20% attack increase but lasting only 1 turn. Following Garcia is Momo, who also has 2 self-buffs. Doom Waken lasts for 3 turns, providing a 20% attack increase. Her second buff, Repulsion Barrier, grants 2% attack per stack but loses a stack if she takes damage. Next is Xavier's passive, grants a constant 20% attack increase. Finally, we have a tie between Homa and Etta, as both gain a 30% attack increase but only when attacking shielded units. As a notable mention, Auguste has the same self-buff as Gloria, offering a 20% attack increase when attacking from the front. And Nurgle, after blocking, he gains Bayonet Charge that increases ADK by 10% and it can be stacked up to 2 times. If the target has the Hangman's Mark, then the effect is doubled. All stack are removed after an active attack. And Alexei gains a 20% attack and defense increase if he is in a dying state. The remaining units gain either a 5 to 15% attack increase from their self-buffs or a flat amount of attack. The remaining units gain either a 15% attack increase from their self-buffs or a flat amount of attack. Let's move on to self-buffs for damage. The units at the top are benefiting from standard buffs, while those at the bottom receive extra or unique buffs. The units at the top, Tristan, Auguste, and Xavier, each gain a tier 2 damage buffs from their self-buffs, while Summer Rowia being the only one who gains a tier 3 damage buff. I'll focus on ranking the units at the bottom, based on the amount of damage increase provided. Lila leads with a 40% damage increase self-buff, though it lasts only 1 turn. Following her is Nurgle, providing a 30% damage increase. Nurgle's requires the Hanged Men's Mark on the enemy and the Bayonet Charge buff. Next is Alexei, who gains Gore Drinker for 2 turns when attacked. Each stack of Gore Drinker increases damage and lifesteal by 20%, stacking up to 3 times. Next is Magnus, who gains a 30% damage increase but only when he strikes back. Otherwise, he only gets a 10% damage increase. We have Tristan that gains a 25% damage increase by sacrificing 90% of her HP, but this can only be used once per battle. Next, we have Summer Rowia benefits from a variable 10 to 20% damage increase depending on her vitality stacks. Finally, Momo consistently receives a 10% damage increase. Now let's move on to level 2 buffs. The buffs you can receive from level 2 buffs include attack, crit, physical defense, magic defense, movement, healing, and immunity to attribute debuffs. The top unit in this category is Istria, who can gain up to 4 level 2 buffs if the target has no buffs and Istria has no debuffs. Next is Flavia, who gains 2 level 2 buffs if she ends her turn within the flower field. It also grants 2 random level 2 buffs to her summoned plants, and the effect lasts for 2 turns. To me, this is the most consistent option among all the other units. The downside is that she receives the buffs at the end of her turn. Additionally, I'm unsure due to translation whether the plants receive the buffs when Flavia ends her turn or if the plants need to end their turn to gain the buffs. Next is Koir, who receives 2 level 2 buffs if an enemy dies while affected by the list debuff. Finally, we have Beryl, who gains 1 level 2 buff at the start of her turn. Up next, we've got Ignored Defense. All units at the top are getting a 40% ignored defense, while only Lila receives a 20%. At the top, we have Summer Rowia, whose skill has an instant effect lasting for 2 turns with a 4-turn cooldown. Next is Auguste, who gains the buff upon reaching 6 stacks of rage, also lasting for 2 turns. Then there's Garcia, who activates the buff with 9 stacks of rotational acceleration. Next, Homa and Etta are tied, each gaining 40% ignored defense but only when attacking shielded units. Iggy follows, receiving the buff exclusively when attacking from a highland position. Next, Nungle's passive skill allows her basic attacks to ignore 40% of the enemy's defense. Lastly, Lila, Akambi, Rowia, and Beryl gain ignored defense for just 1 turn, with the effect directly tied to an attack skill. Let's move on to self-buffs for crit rate. Units at the top benefit from standard buffs, while those at the bottom receive extra or unique buffs. At the very top, units receive Tier 2 crit buffs. Levita gains a Tier 3 crit buff when using a Fire-type skill, and Kal gains a Tier 5 crit buff. I'll focus on ranking the units at the bottom, based on the amount of crit provided. At the top, we have Nungal, who benefits from multiple sources of self-buffs. The first is a passive that provides 30% crit when attacking enemies marked with the Hangman's mark. The second is a 15% crit increase when she enters sniping stance. The third is a 60% crit increase when she uses deadly aim, as long as the target has the Hangman's mark. Following Nungal, there's a tie between Istria and Fekal, both gaining a 45% crit increase. Istria receives her 45% crit from an instant skill that lasts 4 turns. However, once the effect ends, her attack and defense are reduced by 8% for 3 turns. Fekal, on the other hand, gains a 45% crit increase from his passive when it's not his turn, along with an additional 10% crit for each debuff on the enemy. Next, Rowia, Summer Rowia, Garcia, and Lily will each gain 30% crit. Rowia obtains the buff from an instant skill, while Summer Rowia has a similar skill. This one does not any energy but add an extra turn of cooldown, also is the same skill that grant an ignored defense buff and 10 stacks of vitality. Garcia gains her 30% crit when she reaches 3 stacks of rotational acceleration, and Lilywell gets the 30% crit when she attacks from a highland position. Next is Tristan, who gains a 20% crit increase when using Blood Rage. Following her is Kal that has 2 sources of crit buffs, each granting 15%. One triggers if there are no allies within 2 tiles of her, and the other is a passive that triggers when a character is defeated in battle, giving her Feverish Beast, which grants 15% crit and life steal per stack, up to 5 times. Finally, Hasna gains a 15% crit increase when using the skill Penetrates the Bones. Let's move on to self-buffs for crit damage. Units at the top are benefiting from standard buffs, while those ranked lower gain extra or unique buffs. The top units are receiving Tier 1 crit damage buffs, while Levita gains a Tier 3 crit damage buff when using a Fire-type skill. I'll focus on ranking the units at the bottom based on the amount of crit damage provided. Leading this list are Nungal, Garcia, and Fekal, each receiving 30% crit damage. Nungal has a passive that provides 30% crit damage when attacking enemies marked with the Hangman's mark. Garcia gains her 30% crit damage when she reaches 6 stacks of rotational acceleration. On the other hand, Fekal gains a 30% crit damage from his passive when it's not his turn. Next is Tristan, who gains a 20% crit damage increase when using Blood Rage. Summer Rowia gains 10% crit damage at 20 vitality, with an additional 10% at 30 vitality. Hasna gains a 15% crit damage increase when using the skill Penetrates the Bones. Finally, Lilywell gets a 10% crit damage increase from her passive. Let's move on to RNG buffs. At the top, we have Summer Sophia, who grants 2 random level 2 buffs when using a support or healing skill on an ally. This effect lasts for 2 turns. Next is Miguel, who can apply a debuff to an enemy. Any ally attacking that enemy with the debuff receives 2 random level 2 buffs, but these buffs only last for 1 turn. The skill has a range of 1 to 6 tiles, targets only a single ally, the effect lasts for 3 turns and has a cooldown of 4 turns. Following Miguel is Inanna, who at the end of her turn heals the 2 lowest health allies and grants each one a random level 2 buff. The trait has a range of 4 tiles around her, the effects last for 2 turns. Last but not least is Flavia, who can dispel 3 debuffs and convert them into level 2 buffs. Despite providing 3 random level 2 buffs, I ranked her lower because the effect depends on having debuffs to dispel. The skill has a range of 0 to 6 tiles, targets only a single ally, the effect lasts for 2 turns with no cooldown. That's it for the ranking. So which unit stands out as the best buffer or debuffer overall? For me, the top 2 buffers are, first, Tear. He brings tier 2 buffs in speed, attack, movement, and damage. What really sets him apart is his ability to restore energy. And if that's not impressive enough, his skill that provides tier 2 damage activates instantly. If you're looking to add even more damage, he also has an aura that boosts damage and piercing damage. The unit's weakness? His attack and damage buffs apply only to a single ally. The other unit is Summer Sophia. She provides 2 extra attack buffs. The first comes from her trait, where any ally who attacks an enemy with the mobile team mark gains increased attack within 6 tiles around her. The second is the co-attack buff. Her trait also grants 2 random level 2 buffs to any ally she targets with a support or healing skill. So, if luck's on your side, you could get up to 3 different types of attack buffs. What makes her stand out is her ability to provide assisting attacks and the ability to reposition allies. The unit's weakness? She doesn't offer any dispels for debuffs or enemy buffs, and the extra buffs she grants are random, aside from the 2 attack buffs. Next up are my top 2 debuffers, starting with Core. His debuffs include tier 2 speed reduction, 2 to 3 random level 2 debuffs, and the ability to nullify passive, reaction, and aura skills, plus a tier 1 movement reduction. Earlier, I mentioned that Akambi was the only unit capable of inflicting more than 3 debuffs, but I hadn't accounted for the fact that Core's list debuffs also apply 2 additional level 2 debuffs. So, in total, Core can inflict up to 5 level 2 debuffs if he chooses to. What makes him unique isn't just the variety of debuffs he offers, but also his ability to dispel all of an enemy's buffs if they have the listed buffs and he uses his conviction skill. The unit's weakness? He lacks a dedicated physical or magic defense down, so you're relying on chance that one of those level 2 debuffs lands on physical or magic defense. The other unit is Akambi. His debuffs include tier 2 magic defense reduction, movement reduction, and nullification of passive skills, reaction skills, and assistance effects. Additionally, he can apply multiple level 2 debuffs, though it's actually his summon unit that applies these. The unit's weakness? The energy cost of his skills is high, and you'll need to keep the summon alive to maintain all those debuffs. How about you guys? Who's your top buffer or debuffer? Let me know in the comments. Just to clarify, I focused only on buffs and debuffs that increase damage dealt, completely ignoring defensive buffs. That's why some units didn't rank as high. Their kit are more defensively oriented. Thank you for watching.